As the judiciary's lawyer in Maryland, representing the courts and the judges and the clerks and those folks, and including in, as Josh mentioned, a surprising number of bankruptcy filings, which you wouldn't think, but here we are. And I realized after some discussion online that this was a skill that a lot of folks don't have, even though I think it's fairly accessible. The thing that I want to say off the top is most automated functions in Microsoft Word are not about the table itself. It's about learning some other skill that enables Microsoft Word to generate a table. So in the table of contents context, some of you will know that those are most easily automatically generated when you're using headings and styles effectively. In this context, in order to understand what makes table of authorities accessible, you have to understand marking authorities and hidden text. And so today, we're going to first understand what that hidden text is, what it looks like and how it works. Second, develop the skill of generating that hidden text so that our tables of authorities know what to look for. And third, learn how to edit, update, and fix that stuff so that your document can do what you need it to. Hopefully by the end, what will become obvious to you is that knowing how to do this one thing is most valuable in that last minute sprint when there is desperate need for quick changes that you can accommodate in the document. And the more you can automate, the more you can accommodate. And so here we go. Our goal is to generate tables of authorities that look roughly like this and to make them automatic and updatable. But like I said, we don't start off by focusing on the table. We start off by focusing on the authority. And so I'm going to start here with a relatively innocuous quotation from one of Justice Kagan's dissents. The thing that we need to focus on here is just that there is an authority for the quotation. The one most important thing I can tell you about Microsoft Word today is that in your Home tab, in the paragraph section, there is this paragraph button up here, and behind it is a phenomenal amount of power. When you click it, you get to see everything the document is doing within reason, things you ordinarily don't see or take for granted. So things that you will have noticed right away. Paragraph symbols to mark the end of your paragraph and the beginning of a new one. Spaces in between words have a symbol that show you there's a space there and that show you how many spaces are there. So you can find double spaces and single spaces and triple spaces in documents you're not sure about. It's all visually available. In the same way, you have access to tab characters that would ordinarily be blank on your screen. You can see them when you have this paragraph symbol turned on. And as is most relevant for us today, you can see this thing here, this underlined, sort of dotted, hidden text that appears only when I have the paragraph symbol on. So the first thing I want you to understand is exactly what this hidden text says so that you understand how Microsoft Word understands it. There are basically four elements, right? We have this TA here at the front, which basically stands for Table of Authorities. It lets Microsoft Word know that this little hidden element is something that will be relevant to generating a table of authorities. Then this \L here asks, what is the long form citation for the authority? There's L for long. And here, because we're citing American Express, we need, in these quotation marks, to have the entire citation to American Express, exactly as you want it to appear in your table of authorities in long form. And so you'll notice, for example, here that I haven't included a pin site inside this hidden text because I don't want pin sites in my tables of authorities, even though I have one in the body of the text itself, so the author knows where I'm citing from. Once we get past this quoted long form citation, we have this \s, which you guessed it, is for the short form citation, where you decide, or at least you tell Microsoft Word what this citation is likely to look like anytime it appears in the document. And so I use an abbreviated version of the Blue Book short form citation, because I might cite lots of different pages of Italian colors later in a document, but I will always begin the citation with Italian colors, comma, the volume, the reporter, and the word at. And so by telling Microsoft Word what my short forms are going to look like, I empower it to find other citations to the same authority in the same document. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So we got the table of authorities element, the long form element, the short form element, and lastly, the category element. \C stands for category. And here, Microsoft Word allows you to customize the names of categories in your tables of authorities, but it has some defaults. And as you will have guessed, \C1 is category 1, which is cases. So all of my cases are going to be in category 1 whenever I create a table of authorities. And as you saw during my opening page, because this hidden text exists in my document, because it's on page 2 of my document, our automated table of authorities up here knows exactly what to write and where it appears. And so all I'm going to do for most of the rest of this talk is generate a couple of these so we get a feeling for how this works, create some problems for you, some common pitfalls, and see if I can make it as engaging and productive as I can. So the first thing we're going to do, moving from our prefabbed citation, is move to some unmarked citations. So here I have 2 citations to Glossip, one from Justice Sotomayor and one from Justice Breyer. And you'll notice, because we have the hidden text turned on, these aren't marked. There isn't one of those, one of these marked brackets next to it. So let's generate one. So this is the next most important thing I have to teach folks, and that's how to find the generate button. So I'm going to highlight this for now. In your references tab, we're going to go from the home tab to the references tab. There is an entire section dedicated to tables of authorities. And it basically only has 2 buttons: mark citations and insert table of authorities. We're in mark citation land. So I'm going to click here. And as for those of you who are power users who do this all the time and are going to want to do it really fast, you'll notice that when you mouse over the button, it tells you what the hotkey is. So it says right there that you can click Alt-Shift-I to open up a mark citation window. I'm just going to click. And what I get is this dialog box. And here's where I have to apologize a little bit. I can make a lot of things in this presentation bigger. I can't make this box bigger. So I hope that you can see it fairly clearly. But if you can't, trust me about what I'm saying is in there and what I'm doing to it. As you might have imagined, the left side of this dialog box just has all the elements we just talked about. Up here, we have the long form citation that's going to go behind the \L. Down here in the short citation, we have the short form citation that's going to go behind the \S. And in this dropdown, we have a list of all of our categories of things, so we know that category 1 is cases. So I'm going to set up this mark citation dialog box to do what I want to appear in the table of authorities. So for example, I will delete this pin site because I'm not going to want that in my table of authorities. And I'll delete this comma too. Some of you might even be work for yourself or for facilities who prefer to have the citation on the next line after the case name. And you can do that right in this dialog box. You can hold Shift and press Enter and create the return carriage right in the dialog, or you can leave it as a space. And so I'll leave it as a space for now.
Could I ask a quick question about the category dropdown?
Of course you can.
Did you generate that list, or is it something that existed there already?
This existed there already. These are your Microsoft Word default categories, I'm fairly sure. And so they cover most of the kinds of things you'll need: cases, statutes, other authorities, rules, treatises, regulations, constitutional provisions. But if you want to rename them or reorganize them, you can. I'm gonna do that right now because we won't come back to it for any reason. This little category button on the right lets you go in here and rename any of them. So if instead of treatises, you want land records documents, you can have it. And so this is customizable, but what I'm showing you is the stuff that comes stock right in Microsoft Word. So we'll leave this alone. We'll come back here, we'll finish this. We've got our long form is done. We've got our category correct, it's a case. And on our short form, I'm gonna call this just Glossip, not Glossip v. Gross. And it will always start with 135S Supreme Court at. And now I'm going to show you the two other buttons we haven't covered here so far: the mark button and the mark all button. The mark button just generates this bracketed hidden text and places it right here at the end of your citation. The mark all button does that and then goes looking for any other instance of this short form text and marks those too. So at least in theory, if I've done this correctly, when I hit mark all, and I'm going to do it right now, I generated not just this bracket here, which created our citation for Glossip, but also this shorter bracket here that just says, here's a table of authorities entry for something with the short form Glossip. So in one fell swoop, I've marked this and every subsequent short form iteration of the case. Knowing how to do this is incredible, not just because it speeds up your ability to get through a document, but also because if later on in your document, you find a short form citation to Glossip and it's not marked, don't assume the computer got it wrong, assume you did. What if this is misspelled? What if there's only one S here? What if it was actually called gross instead of Glossip in the short form earlier? Why is it that Microsoft Word didn't catch it? That's correct. Michael makes a great point, or Mikek? Maybe I'm assuming it's a typo. Michael makes a great point. This won't catch id, which I sometimes do custom. The good part about id is it very often appears either on the same page or so close to another citation that it will already appear in your table of authorities for you, but you can do those one at a time, and we'll talk about how you would do that in just a second. So let's just get rid of this for a second to show you one more piece of functionality. If you don't do the mark all, or if for some reason you can't, and you're going through your text and you find one of these citations, and you go to hit mark, our dialog box finds it in your list of already generated citations and tells you this is what the long form would be like if you select this existing citation. And so very quickly you can highlight a thing, mark it as the thing you know it already is, and you're on to the next citation. So we've got Glossip with mark, we've got Glossip with mark all. I've thrown in here another citation to a Maryland authority just to give you guys one quick example of something in from state law. So here I will hit my hotkey, but you guys could hit your button. I'll go up here, I'll nix the pin site and this extra comma. I'll make sure that I'm in the right category. The category is cases, and I will call it Carter 461 Maryland at, and I'm done. It's marked. It's that fast. And that is how every case in your document is going to get marked. So we'll slide down here to the third page. We'll do a couple of quick examples from statutes. For those of you who are really keenly paying attention, you'll notice that this space marker here which I'll turn off the paragraph symbol for a second. This space here and this space here are different. This is just a space. This one is what happens if you hold Control and Shift when you press space. It's a linked space. When you use a linked space like this, and actually Westlaw will sometimes generate these automatically when you copy it with their formatting. When you see a linked space like this, all it means is that the stuff before the link and the stuff after the link won't ever wind up on different lines of your page. So if this were a much longer sentence about things, you'll notice that as I finish the word things, the entire word moves to the next line. That section symbol will never break away from that 717, but this is still a space. Yet another thing you get to keep track of when what you're doing is looking at the hidden text in your document to see how your document really works. Let's do these really quick. Administrative Procedure Act, Section 6. Probably maybe your table of authorities will just have this in it. Maybe it will have the whole thing. I'll just do the US Code citation for now. So we would go to references, hit our Mark Citation button. This is a statute, not a case. And now the one thing that I want to emphasize is worth thinking about a different way every time you engage this process. For statutes and rules, what you choose to be your short citation should be whatever you can confidently say. Anytime this appears in my document, it's a reference to this citation. So often that might be any reference to section 555, right? In a lot of cases, you're going to have one reference to these kinds of specific statute numbers. But if you're going to refer to it in different ways, maybe sometimes you write the word section out, you write section 155 rather than just the section mark. This won't catch those. So maybe in that case, you want to mark anytime the phrase 555 appears in your document. But then you've got to make sure that that doesn't appear as a volume number for a case or a reporter number or something like that. So if you want to do mark all, this short citation might require you to think critically about what kinds of things you have in your document and what you can consistently mark. But for now, I'm going to mark it as 555. I don't have to mark all. I can just mark this one for now. Once you've marked it, remember what it is that you've called the short form citation, because that's what you'll highlight later on in the document to get it marked fast. So if I were to find another citation to that same section, I want to remember that 555 is what I highlight, because when I hit mark, oh, sorry, my window's way down here, it will come up right away and I can mark these really fast.
So we got a question from Eugene. Is it not possible to have multiple short forms associated with a single long form?
Not for this purpose.
Okay.
I don't think that there is a way to code those or for Word to use them. It's a great question. So you're gonna want to think through what is your most consistent, not over-inclusive, not under-inclusive short form. And again, if you're ever nervous that you're going to be over or under inclusive, just don't use that mark all button. Just come back and remark these whenever you see them in your document. You can always move line by line through. And I'll give you an example of that later on when we're finished with the content. So here's another one to really quickly mark up, just so we have a full roster. We've got this New York Business and Corporate Law, Section 717. And here again, I'll mark the short form as just 717. Let's assume that's where we're headed. And again, as Michael pointed out earlier, this id at section 718 is a really interesting problem for us, because what it actually means is not that id refers to the same citation, but instead that there is a reference to section 718 in this document and section 17. So if I'm going to copy all of this for a second. I'm going to copy this entire citation. If I were to stumble into this kind of id problem, I might highlight the whole thing and mark it. And then up here in my long form citation, I can't rely on this id to do the work in my table of authorities that I need it to do. So I might instead paste in the section 717 long form and change it to 718 so that I get both to appear in full in my table of authorities. That's a statute, and its short form citation might just be 718. Get that marked. And really quickly, we'll do this Article 8, Clause 10. Almost all of these examples are straight from the blue pages of the blue books. And so we'll mark this Constitution portion using our Mark Citation button. It's a constitutional provision, and it's roughly correct. I mean, maybe Clause 10 is our short form or something like that. Marked. So we understand the anatomy of these. We know how to create these, and we know how to use them to mark up citations as we're working through a document. Let's take a look at the result of all that work we've done. So real quick, I'm going to turn off that paragraph symbol. All of our marks disappear from the text of the document. First thing I'll do is take this cases table, and I'll just update it. And you'll notice that really quickly, I've got that Carter case we did earlier, the Glossop case we did earlier, and one from page 4 that I've used to show a common error in tables of authorities. Yes, Michael is absolutely right. This ought to happen very close to the end of drafting. The more it's automated, the more flexible it is. The more flexible you are when you're finishing drafting, but this is something you want to do to wrap up your document.
Yeah, and I think that answers a question from Deborah. Like, what if you add a citation later in the document? You just basically walk through the same steps for the citation, right-click here on this table with update.
Right.
Yeah, and then it will add that new citation as a part of your table.
Exactly right. And so, imagine, actually, let's take an easy example. So let's take our citation to Carter out for a second. Let's go up here and update our table. Carter's gone because the tag is gone and it knows to update for no tag. So imagine then that someone is last minute editing your brief and they add a citation to one more case, and that one more case is Carter. All you got to do, grab Carter and get that mark back in. I've just copy pasted it in here to save us some time. And then hop up here and update. So if someone has a last minute authority to dump into your document, all you got to do is make sure you get it marked. As long as you've got these tables built out, it's going to do the work for you. So let's also, we've talked about updating tables, and F9 is the power key for updating tables.
I'm just seeing that. Yeah,
correct.
Thank you, Daniel. That's a great tip. Press F9 to update your table. Oh.
And Peter's got a great tip for users in the chat also.
So since we're recording this, they won't be able to see the chat. So we should mention these things verbally. Yeah.
So as Peter notes, we talked a little bit earlier about how you can customize the categories in your document. If you have a statute where you're going to cite to lots and lots of little provisions of the statute, you can use those category headings to break out those citations into, if you have a really dense EPA Clean Air Act case, you can make a whole heading that's dedicated to the Clean Air Act and then cite sections or subsections individually, exactly the same way we're doing things here. And I'm gonna pause on the other comments for a minute because I promised they're way ahead of the class, but the class is going to catch up to them. I'm going to insert now a table of authorities using our cleverly titled Insert Table of Authorities button so that we can learn how this works. The first thing I'll note is that all of our categories are available here for inserting. I spent a lot of time working for an organization that had in its style guide a list of the order that each of these categories should appear in your table of authorities. So I would always insert them one by one to make sure I had them in our preferred order. In this case, after cases, we're going to insert statutes. And I'll just, for right now, I'm just going to say, okay, I'm going to insert our statutes. And for people who were worrying about bad problems in our table of authorities, I've inserted some problems on page 4 just to make this complicated. But for now, you can see that as soon as I insert that statute table of authorities, everything we marked on page 3 is now came through as a statute. And we could also insert a table of authorities for constitutional provisions. Before I do, I want to show you a couple of things that I see people in the chat already interested in. First of all, when you go to insert a table of authorities through this interface, you have a couple of options here on the left. The most important one is this checkbox here that says whether or not the table of authorities should use the word passim for authorities that appear lots and lots of times in the same document. That is sometimes necessary. There are circuit courts of appeals that demand that you never use passim and tell them every page your authority appears on. For those places, you'd want to make sure you check this box off. You also have options about how to separate the number from the citation. Almost always you're going to want to use these periods, but you could use asterisks or underscores. And then in the bottom right here, there's another really important button, which is this modify button. The modify button lets you tell Microsoft Word exactly how to format the heading for your table of authorities and the authorities in your table of authorities. So the reason my statutes heading looks like this is because I made it custom. I clicked on table of authorities heading, I clicked modify, and I decided I wanted it left aligned and single spaced. I decided that I wanted in the paragraph formatting that I wanted space after the paragraph, this 12 points of space in between the heading and the body text. And so each of those decisions was one I made on purpose and one I could change. I could make it not bold, or I could center our table of authorities headings. I'll do that now just so you can see it, and just hit OK, and it's done. Similarly, with the table of authorities entries themselves on the modify button, you can choose how to format them. Single space, double space, space before the paragraph, space after the paragraph. How much do you want this indent to be on the second line? Because by default, the answer is 2/9 of an inch. And I have no idea why it's 2/9 of an inch. Seems like it could be 1/4 of an inch, and nobody would be too offended. So you have extraordinary control over how each of these is formatted right in this interface. And when you finish and insert your table, everything is going to match up perfectly. You get exactly the same table heading style. You get exactly the same lead and leader. You get exactly the same content. So now, we talked about how to find and understand the hidden strings in our document. We talked about how to create the hidden strings in our document. Now we're going to talk about how to fix the hidden strings in our document. As some of you have noticed, we got 2 huge glaring problems in our table of authorities. The first is a case you didn't see me mark, but one that has a pin site in the table of authorities that we're going to want to nix. And the second is this case citation that appears in our statutes section. This happens to me all the time. This is so easy to do by accident, but it is also so easy to fix. And I've placed all of our problem children on page 4. We got our category error and our pin site error right here. I'm going to go into my home tab. I'm going to go into my paragraph block and turn on hidden text so I can see what's going on. What I remember was wrong about this citation was that it's in the wrong category. It was in statutes. All I have to do to change it, literally all I have to do, change category 2 to category 1. Citation fixed, done, next. I forgot to remove a pin site from this because I just copied this and made it into a long form site and just forgot. You forget, it happens. Delete the pin site, delete the comma, done. You have fixed exactly what you came here to fix. You fixed all the errors in your table of authorities. turn off hidden text, hop back up to your table, and hit some updates. And here I'll use the F9 key for our power user. And here we go. All of a sudden, that citation we were worried about before has moved up to the cases, and our pin cite problem for this pi case is gone.
Are we seeing a format issue with the pi case as well? Shouldn't it be in italicized text, or am I just misreading it?
Oh, no, I think this is italicized. I've just picked an unfamiliar font for folks.
Gotcha.
But that's fine. You know, and maybe this is the moment you notice things, right? So here, one thing people might notice in this is that this Sha'ari Tefillah congregation is kind of awkward. It doesn't quite have enough space before this 4. We could do that thing I was talking about earlier where we add that return carriage in here between the case name and the authority. So let's hop down there to page 4 where it exists. Let's open up our hidden text. And in our long form citation, let's put this shift enter where the space was before. You'll notice this little return carriage appears. And then turn off our hidden text. Hop back up here and watch what happens. Oh, that's not what we want. We got a problem. Let's fix this one too, just because it's really fun. Let's go in here and modify our table of authorities entries so that they're not fully justified. They're just left justified. That was a disaster.
Good example.
Good example, right? Exactly.
Oh.
And there it is. Because the tag has this return carriage in here, the table of authorities does exactly what you marked it up to do. And it will automatically update if you add things later. And you could do that routinely for every citation you ever create, or you could do it when you see a problem with formatting. But it's really accessible, and you can micromanage it yourself and make sure this works exactly the way you want it to work. And again, because you did it yourself, everything is updatable, everything is navigable, everything is manageable. When you use, say, Westlaw Drafting Assistant to do this, you get almost the same thing. You get roughly these kinds of citations, and the drafting assistant does mark them for you in the document. But what it does is, instead of using some common understandable short form citation, it makes up some automated one. It calls itself like Thomson Reuters Westlaw Drafting Assistant citation underscore bazillion. And it just sort of tries to automate itself on these unique tokens. And so if you use it, it's just impossible to fix. With this, everything is visible, everything is fixable. When you go to mark something later and your short form citations make sense to you, you will automatically be able to find it in your list of authorities here, in your short form citations, be able to mark it quickly. And just double click on things and you're done. The last thing that I want to say, just a big reminder to folks about how this stuff works. And actually, let's go to a demo document for what I'm about to say. I'm going to stop that share, and then I'm going to share a different window. This is a different document. It's a brief that I wrote me and several other people wrote several months ago in a case where we recently got beat. And I want to use it for a couple of reasons. The first is to show you what it looks like when we do this in the document itself. So here's a perfectly ordinary brief that has perfectly ordinary writing and citation, and it's already marked. So if I hit this paragraph button, and I go back down to where I was, here we go. You know, I was telling you, you can see tab characters, you can see headings. You can see that Matherly here is marked, and you can see exactly how it's marked. You can see I'm using that return carriage system so that the table of authorities has things on 2 lines. You can see how we're marking the First Amendment and Word versus Rock Against Racism and Clark versus Community for Creative Nonviolence. The reason I opened this up is mostly to show you, when you start doing this and you really get things marked up, your document gets pretty long. You'll notice that with the hidden text turned on, this document is 53 pages long. But with paragraph turned off, it's only 47. So I have 6 pages of hidden text in here. And the reason that's super, super, super important is because up here in the table of authorities, let's take a look at, keep your eye on Chandler versus Florida.
Okay.
If I update this table of authorities, what is going to happen to this 3, 4, 10, 11, 25, 28? It's going to become 4, 12, 13, 28, 33. Because with the hidden text turned on, that's where those citations are. They're deeper in the document. So the last, and I think there's one viewer here who was the poor guy who had to suffer me making this mistake once in a real brief. Whenever you're updating your tables of authorities or your tables of contents even, make sure this paragraph symbol is off so that what you're updating them to reflect is where those things appear in the naturally appearing document. You always want to make sure that's the last thing you do. We had a comment earlier about how a lot of these things are things you want to do very near the end of the writing process. Same thing here. The absolute last thing you do at the very end of the writing process ought to be turn off hidden text, update all your tables. And if you've coded things correctly, if you've used headings for your table of contents, if you've used marked citations for your table of authorities, all of this updating your case table, updating your constitution table, updating your statute table, updating your rule table, you get to the end and your other authorities table, and now you're done. That's the last thing you do. And everything is ready to head out the door. So that's the way this works for me. I think the more you engage it, the more you take seriously the ways that this works, and the more you use it, the more helpful it can be. The more you use it, the more you'll start to get a feel for when something's wrong and what kinds of things can go wrong. You got the wrong category, you've got the wrong short form, something's misspelled. Here's an easy example of how it's helpful. If you get to something that's a long form citation and it's already on your citation list, you made a mistake in the text of your document. It ought to be a short form there, and you know to fix it. And so the more you get to use this, the more you can use it to streamline your writing and to streamline the process at the end of your writing, and to empower the people around you to help you out and make changes and make improvements, and add citations in real time and make the most of your time fixing the document.
That's great.
So I think that's it for me. What can I do from chat and from our question and answer session over here?
So let me feed you a couple. One thing Jason asked is, do you need to worry about making changes within the table itself? Like if you update the table manually and then refresh, will those changes go away?
They will disappear in a heartbeat. As much as humanly possible, you don't want to change the table itself, you want to change the mark. So for example, imagine Oklahoma ought to have been abbreviated here in this citation on page 16. If you go ahead and just make it oak here, then any update will undo the work you just did. Oklahoma will become Oklahoma again because it's going to refresh everything in the document. So instead, use your reference here to go find it. The easiest way usually for me is to highlight it, press Control F for the find function. And you'll notice that it appears here, and it appears down here in section C where it's originally placed. And I know there's hidden text here, and I know how to fix the hidden text. And when I fix the hidden text, I'm assuming OK is an abbreviation for Oklahoma for this purpose. Maybe it isn't. When I fix the hidden text, because I'm here, I can also fix the text of my document, because I don't want the table of authorities to mismatch the citation in the document. I'm right here, and I can get it all done at once.
Perfect.
hopefully the more you do it in the document, the better off you are in the writing, not only in the table.
It's Mike Check or Michael asks, so if you want to do a 2-line citation like you have before, you have to set the first line indent to what you want, or is it using that hard character turn that you showed before?
Oh yeah, okay. So so you'll notice in this document, we've got everything set to 2-line citations. I've got the case name on the first line. I've got the reporter, the volume and page number and all the court information on the second line. There are 2 things that are making that work. The first is that in the table of authorities, modify, table of authorities, modify, format, paragraph. In here somewhere, whoa, format paragraph. This system is set up so that the second line of any entry is going to be hanging by 1/4 of an inch. We could increase this, we could decrease it, but this is the way the paragraph is formatted. I inherited this from somebody else, I think, which is why it's 1/4 of an inch and not 2/9 of an inch or whatever. But that's the first thing you want to do, is make sure that your formatting is set up to be able to manage hanging. And then in the citations themselves, we'll take an example from the document, this Westmoreland case. We'll turn on hidden text so we can see what's going on. I've used this hard return, as you mentioned, right in between the name of the case and the reporter and volume number. And the combination of those 2 things is what gets you what you need. And
the keyboard combination that you hit was shift and return there.
Shift and enter, depending on how your right-hand side of your keyboard is built. But yeah, exactly.
And we've got another formatting question. We have Yolanda asked, how did you keep the section mark and the text together?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, and I believe that was a shift in space.
It was control shift and space.
Control shift and space. Thank you.
I have to do this all of the time, and this is almost bonus content at this point. So I have statutes in Maryland that have hyphens in them. I don't want the paragraph to break in between section and the section number. And I don't want the paragraph to break on a hyphen, because sometimes Microsoft Word likes to do this sort of thing.
Yeah.
That's no bueno either. And so I'm going to turn on our paragraph symbol so we can see what's going on in here. I didn't do it here, but we'll show you how it would work. Instead of a space, I want a linked space, which is going to have that symbol right there.
So you highlighted the space symbol, the little dot, and then you hit Control Shift Space.
Exactly. And I can hold Control and Shift and enter as many of them as I need, but we'll just do the one for now. And then over here with the hyphen, I can do exactly the same thing. I can hold Control and Shift and hit hyphen. This will look exactly the same from a distance in the document itself. It's only really visible because I've got this hidden text on, so I can see what's going on. This is going to be a hyphen just like anything else, but it's a non-breaking hyphen. This entire string from the section symbol to the end of the section will always appear on the same line. It will never break over at the end of a line.
That's amazing.
And
I'm such a typesetting nerd.
It's super useful. When I took my first law job, my boss really didn't like it when Mr. appeared at the end of a line. And so I always use those linked spaces between Mr. and the person's name. And it's so much better, because what ends up happening is people wind up trying to do it manually, right? Instead of using these linked spaces and typesetting exactly what you want, they go to where they think the break should be and they insert the break manually, which seems like a good idea until later on in the editing process, there are some changes and some words go away. And all of a sudden that line starts to look really stupid because you've got this manual break and Microsoft Word has no idea what to do. So the more you use these linked entries to make sure that you're getting the breaks where you want them, the less you have to muck around with extra return carriages and weird stuff in your text.
That's really great tip. So we had 2 people ask about the order of citations being listed within the table itself. Is that adjustable?
I don't think so, and folks are welcome to correct me. I think that this will always be done alphanumerically. It is a little annoying sometimes, so I think in this case, I've got Maryland legislative like enacted Maryland laws. I've got federal statutory code, and I've got Maryland code. And it just sort of organized things alphanumerically so that 1 comes before 2, 2 before 4, and 4 before M.
Yeah.
I don't think that's editable. If you want to be able to do something more specific, you're going to have to do that sort of manually on your own, or ask for some typesetting help. But what I can say is, if this becomes a problem, think about building out more categories so that it looks more natural. So if you're having a problem like this and you think that these legislative history sort of enacted law citations just look out of place, make a different section that says statutory history, and you just change the category for these to be in that other category you've created. And then make sure you insert a separate table of authorities for that category somewhere so that your decision makes sense.
Okay. We've got another question. Is there a way to make the hidden text a different color from the main text?
Ooh.
Which is a really interesting thing that's done in computer coding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a really slick question, and if there is, I don't know it. It would live in here in your options somewhere, but I have a hunch that you can't quite turn into Microsoft Word into an integrated development environment exactly the way you want to.
Yeah, that is a great question, Daniel. Thank you for asking that.
Really slick.
Oh. So Peter asked, do you try to mark the citations as you're writing the first or second draft, or do you usually go back and try and do all the hidden text entry like in one fell swoop as you work your way through?
So it depends on your familiarity. I think that once you really have mastered this, it is absolutely fine to do it in real time, because if something weird happens, you know how to go in and fix it. So as you get used to this over your first 10 or so documents, and you've seen problems and you've fixed problems, you can go ahead and mark things early. And if something goes wacky, you know how to go through and do a final check of all your marks. Early on, I'd say, though, that you probably want to do this right at the end. One of the things that you will learn when you start to get good at this, and this is something that I guess I should have shown people at an earlier point along the way. I'm going to turn on hidden text for a second. Suppose I'm going to use these sentences again in another brief. And they've got these hidden marks in them for the First Amendment and for these cases. Even if I just grab that text without hidden text turned on, when I copy and paste this, I don't know what's going on, sorry. When I copy and paste this into a new document, the marks will come with it. And so you sort of inevitably, if you're reusing content in your, say you're reusing your motion to dismiss standard or your standard on appeal, you're going to wind up with some already marked stuff just by virtue of the fact that you're recycling the same text from documents you've already marked up. And so at some level, as you get used to this, it'll become much more natural for you to have this markup language accidentally spill over into a document or to do things ahead of time. And as you become more comfortable, you can mark in real time. I think it's best done very near the end of the process, because there are some things that are so easy to check, right? If mark all misses a short form citation and you find just a blank short form that should have already been marked, you can try and figure out why and find a misspelling. If you find duplicate long form citations, you can fix them into short forms. And you avoid duplication, because sometimes you forgot you already marked this somewhere else because you're just sort of writing in free form and you happen to cite the same case again. Now you've got duplication in your table of authorities, and you're going to have to go in there and scrub some of it out later. For the most part, I think you want to mark very near the end, but realize that you can take advantage of prefabricated marks from other documents, and it won't be too bad for you as you get used to it.
So I think that ties into a question from Mike, which he asks, will mark all recognize long form citations? and use the long form citation for both the first and second citation?
I don't think that it will, unless you if you're in an environment where you effectively only ever use long form citations, you can take advantage and do some clever things. So you could, let's take this Ward example. You could make that your short form. You could make the short form citation Ward versus Rock Against Racism 491 US. And now you've built out a system where when you hit mark all, as long as you're only ever using long form citations, you're going to hit all of them. So this is a way to catch those. And there are environments where you might want to do that because the reader might not be familiar with cases you've cited earlier in your work. But no, I think for the most part, you're going to want to use classical short form citations. And then if you stumble into Ward later in the document, say I were marking a new Ward versus Rock Against Racism for the first time, I just got to remember I did it already and hop down here through my list of citations. That's an alphanumeric order. Just find Ward. So you won't have to mark it again in full. You can mark it as though it were a short form, even though what you're grabbing is a long form citation later in the document.
And it looked like when you were typing in the short form, it will do some auto searching as well.
Oh, exactly. So let's get rid of this.
So I was like, oh, I need to find Ward. I type WARD. And is it jumping? There it is. Yeah, it jumped right to it.
So in here, there it is.
Yeah, it didn't show quite on the video.
I don't know how clear. I don't know how clean it was. Let's go up here.
But it did for the audience playing the home game.
Yeah, there you go. It jumped right down.
Yeah, it jumped right down to it.
So yeah, there's a lot of really neat native options here.
And Daniel says, yeah, we can do something similar with marking for id.
Yeah, exactly right. So here we've got a citation to Hastings where I use a subsequent citation with a different quotation. And, I imagine I marked it.
See also, yep.
I've got the see also Westmoreland. I didn't bother to mark this id because it's right next to the other one, and I didn't think it would confuse the court. But if you wanted to, highlight the thing you want to mark, hit your mark button in the references tab. And then when you do, you're looking for Westmoreland, you're looking for
Hastings. Yeah.
And I just start typing, and there it is. You can double click this, or you can just click it and hit mark. In either case, you get your short form mark all set right next to the id, and you're ready to go. And so if in your actual body text, for some reason, there was a page break here between the original and the id, your table of authorities would know to cite pages 13 and 14.
It would adjust automatically.
It would adjust.
Okay, we've got, I think, time for 2 more questions. The first is from Kevin. Is there a way to add hyperlinked text to the table of authorities, such that you could click on it and maybe jump to the citation, for example?
I don't know, Kevin. Let's find out. So let's take a relatively simple entry here that doesn't have a lot of explanatory text, like American Legion here, and add this. So if I grab everything and I go to market in my references tab, this always pops up on a different screen for me. There it is. I'll leave it alone. Let's find out together. I'll mark it. I'll go up to our case authority. Remember, never update without turning off your paragraph symbol.
Hidden text, yeah.
Go up here, update field. And I don't remember. I've got 2 of them, so it's screwing me up. I don't remember what I did. I'm sorry, because I'm doing this in a document I already marked. So I want to get rid of this other markup down here that created my original American Legion mark. All right, let's try that again. Might have been too confusing for our friendly neighborhood table of authorities. No, our table of authorities is horrified and has no idea what's going on.
Okay.
Because it's the wrong category? Let's find out if that's the problem. We learned how to fix this earlier. I wonder if I created my own problem. Category 7, that's not right. Category 1, these are the classic errors. All right, now that it's a case, let's do some, there it is. And so to answer your question, it will keep the formatting for your URL, but it won't be hyperlinked or clickable. That might be designed to avoid some other functionality problems. So for example, sometimes you can make these tables hyperlinkable to later in the document for the PDF version, and they just didn't want to think about what it means to have a hyperlink inside of a hyperlink.
I think that could be a problem. Okay, and our last question, and I think this is maybe a little bit tongue in cheek, but it's from Dan. Why doesn't your font have serifs?
Oh, that's an easy
I think that was
answer.
On the first document. Yeah.
Of course it was. I will share the first document so I can tell you the answer. That's an easy answer. So the best resource I can give you is the 7th Circuit's suggestions and requirements for briefs, which is a very short PDF pamphlet. It will tell you that you want to use serif fonts for long form reading, where the person's going to be sitting there reading for a long time and they're going to have to take in a lot of information, and you want them to be able to follow along. You want to use sans serif fonts for short, easy, breezy reading. And so because everything I was going to show you today was going to be these short clips that you needed to get through real quick, I wanted to give you the benefit of that. And I went to fonts.google.com to find this font. I wanted something where these little markers, these space markers and the tab character and these brackets were as visible to the user as possible, because an awful lot of native Microsoft Word fonts blend these into the next word. So this dot kind of is part of this too, and it doesn't work quite right. I wanted you, the viewer, to be able to see everything as cleanly as possible. And so it may be tongue in cheek, but it was actually a part of how I thought through building out this demo document in the talk.
And remember that some courts do have rules on which fonts are allowed.
Yep.
And so be sure to check your local court's rules when choosing fonts.
Absolutely.
Something I hate that I have to advise, but it does need to be a part of it.
And maybe check more than the local rules. I mean, technically you're allowed to file in Garamond in the DC Circuit, but they just issued a release saying you probably shouldn't.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for it. I actually learned a lot, so thank you, Joe. And I'm seeing several thank you messages come in as well.
Yeah.
I want to remind everybody that we have recorded this. We're going to post it on a place where you can come back and look at it as much as you need to. So it'll probably be a YouTube posting that Joe can share. And we'll be emailing a link to that recording when it's posted. It'll probably be either later today or tomorrow. Yep. So Joe, thank you for volunteering to do this.
Yeah. Of course. I'll also circulate this demo document to the extent I can. And the last thing I want to say is go do this. Like, set aside 20 or 30 minutes this week where you take an old document that didn't have a table of authorities in it and build one. Do it while you remember how. That way you don't have to come back to this and spend another hour later. Get one experience of this under your belt this week, and you're going to thank yourself for it later.
That's a great tip. All right. We'll let everybody get back to their day, but this was really helpful, Joe. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Take care, everybody.
Take care. Bye.